let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to unpack the fascinating and, yeah, sometimes a little intimidating world of educational assessment to see how we actually measure human learning. I mean, think about it. We spend a huge chunk of our lives in classrooms taking exams, quizzes, and practicals, but very few of us actually understand the precise science behind how those measurements are made. Today, we're going to completely change that.
Because let's be honest, as students or parents, we rarely peek behind the curtain of grading, right? We tend to just look at that final letter grade on a report card and, well, move on. But there is an entire pedagogical architecture built around fairness, validity, and learning outcomes that happens long before a red pen ever touches a paper. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the foundations of assessment, move to the types of educational tests, how to build a better test, what's beyond traditional testing, making sense of those scores, and finally, the ultimate goal, learning. Starting off with Section 1, the foundation of assessment, where we'll be clearing the air on pedagogical jargon. In everyday conversation, we use terms like test and evaluation interchangeably all the time, but to a teacher, they mean very different things. Let's start with a test. A test is simply the tool itself. It's the physical paper, the digital form, or the specific procedure used to gather info. Think of it like a ruler. It's just a uniform instrument designed to measure a specific skill or area of knowledge.
Now, once we actually use that tool, we move to measurement. If the test is the ruler, measurement is the act of reading the hash marks. It specifically answers the quantitative question, how much? How many answers were correct? What is the raw score?
But we don't just stop at gathering numbers. Assessment goes way broader. It's this entire continuous process of gathering all these measurements, observations, and artifacts to see exactly where a student stands. It's taking those raw numbers and organizing them into an interpretable form, giving the teacher a really solid basis for making educational decisions.
And finally, we reach evaluation. This is the judgment phase. This is where a teacher looks at all that assessment data, compares it against the standard, and decides if the lesson's goal was actually achieved. So measurement says you got a 75. Evaluation judges whether that 75 means you've actually mastered the material well enough to move on to the next unit.
Moving to Section 2, types of educational tests, mapping the timeline of a classroom.
See, testing isn't just something that happens at the end of the semester. A teacher uses diagnostic tests before instruction even begins just to check for prerequisite skills and identify any learning gaps. Then, during the instruction, they use formative tests, like a teacher walking the room and checking over your shoulder mid-lesson to provide immediate feedback and adjust their teaching on the fly. And finally, after the instruction is complete, they use summative tests to certify mastery and assign that final grade.
That brings us to Section 3, building a better test, the architecture of fairness. Before handing out that final summative exam, teachers have a massive responsibility to ensure the test is fair, reliable, and actually measures what it claims to measure. To guarantee this content validity, teachers don't just randomly write questions. No way. They use a critical blueprint called the Table of Specifications, or TOS. This device ensures that test items perfectly match the learning objectives. I mean, if a teacher spent 80% of a unit teaching fractions, the TOS ensures that 80% of the test isn't accidentally focused on geometry. It aligns the instruction exactly with the assessment.
Once the test is actually built and given, it's absolutely vital to know how we're interpreting those results. Are we comparing a student to their peers? That's a norm reference test. For example, if you get a 60th percentile score, it simply means you did better than 60% of the class. Or are we comparing a student to a specific learning standard? That's a criterion reference test. In this case, your score doesn't depend on anyone else in the room at all. It only measures if you individually achieved that set mastery level.
Next up, Section 4, Beyond Traditional Testing, Entering the Authentic Assessment Era. So modern education is rapidly shifting away from just traditional multiple-choice exams. While traditional tests, those indirect paper and pencil measures, are highly efficient for testing recall, they definitely have limits. Authentic or performance assessment, on the other hand, requires students to directly demonstrate skills in real-world scenarios. Instead of taking a multiple-choice test on how to write a speech, the student actually writes and delivers a speech. Now, because there's no single correct answer here, teachers absolutely must use specific scoring rubrics to keep the grading objective and fair.
A super powerful, authentic tool we're seeing a lot more of is the portfolio. This gathers multiple indicators of a student's progress over time to tell a complete story of their learning.
There are three main types here. First, the working portfolio, which tracks that daily, messy growth. Second, the showcase portfolio, which is honestly like an artist's exhibit displaying only their absolute best, most polished work. And third, the progress portfolio, which is evaluated longitudinally to definitively document mastery over a semester or a whole year.
Which leads into Section 5, Making Sense of Scores, Demystifying Educational Statistics.
Okay, so after all those traditional tests and authentic portfolios are graded, what do teachers actually do with all that numerical data? Take a look at these 10 math test scores from a hypothetical classroom. We're going to use them to understand descriptive statistics, which are the vital tools teachers use to see the big picture. And we're going to do it without getting bogged down in complex mathematical formulas. I promise.
If we add all those scores up and divide by 10, we get the arithmetic average of 44.1. That's the mean. The mean is the most common measure of central tendency, but it comes with a bit of a warning label. A mean can be easily skewed by a few extreme high or low scores. Like if one student got a 0, the whole class average plummets, making it look like nobody understood the lesson.
Now notice the number 40. This is our median. If you line up all the scores from lowest to highest, the median is the exact middle point separating the top half of the class from the bottom half. Unlike the mean, the median isn't heavily affected by extreme outliers, so it often gives a much more reliable picture of where the typical student actually sits. Beyond just finding the middle, teachers also look at the standard deviation. And hey, this is really just a fancy way of measuring the scatter of the scores. If a class has a small standard deviation, it means almost everyone scored very close to the average. The class performed uniformly. But a large standard deviation means the scores were all over the place. Some students aced it, some completely failed. This tells the teacher right away that the instruction didn't land equally for everyone.
And if scores are surprisingly low or wildly scattered, a good teacher doesn't just blame the students, they do an item analysis. They check the difficulty index of a specific question to see if it was simply too hard, but more importantly, they look at the discrimination index. Get this. If an item has a negative discrimination index, it means the students who failed the overall test actually got that specific question right, while the top students got it wrong. That is a massive red flag. It indicates that the test item itself was likely flawed, ambiguous, or just confusing, and it should probably be thrown out entirely.
Finally, Section 6, the ultimate goal, learning. Why measurement matters.
We have to constantly remind ourselves that the end goal of all this measurement, statistics, and analysis isn't just to assign a letter grade or rank students against each other. The core philosophy of modern education is assessment for learning. It's a dynamic feedback loop. We gather this data precisely to adjust our teaching, pinpoint weaknesses, and ensure that real, meaningful learning is actually taking place in the minds of the students.
I'll leave you with this final thought for our explainer today. The next time you encounter a test, whether you're the one taking it or the one administering it, how will you shift your perspective? How can you view that assessment not as a terrifying penalty or a final judgment, but as a deeply informative roadmap for your future growth? Something to think about. Thanks for exploring the science of assessment with me today.